Well, thank you, Mike, and good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you. And I think probably about a week ago, many of you tuned in for Ed Lowe and his talk uh, dealing with the election of 1864 and the implications of the Atlanta campaign, as well as some other factors on President Lincoln's hopes for a second term in office. So tonight we'll sort of pick up on that story, if you will, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than Ed certainly would have had time to do in regards to the Atlanta campaign. I'll start with the cover image, and before I forget, at the end, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Just enter them in the chat window, and I'll stay on as long as Mike will let me when we finish and until all questions are answered. So I would encourage you to participate. And thanks again, Mike and the Civil War Roundtable Congress for hosting all these great programs, probably not including mine, talking about all the other speakers that are great. Everybody always asks about this image on the cover slide. Fascinating story. I could talk, I won't, but I could talk for a long time just about this image. It's actually part of the outer defensive works, which eventually completely encircled Atlanta, built by the Confederate forces under the tutelage of Captain Lemuel Grant. Um, but this particular photo was taken after Atlanta fell in early September by George Barnard. So you have federal troops occupying fortifications originally built by the Confederates. And the Federals obviously made a few tweaks and reconfigured part of the defensive work. So it's a fascinating story. The Confederates leave, the Federals move right in to the exact same locations where the Confederates had hoped to try to hold Atlanta. So people always get a kick. I got so many questions about that image, that I ended up putting that image on my business cards. So it's a good thought starter, if you will. Speaking of starters, you can't talk about the Atlanta campaign of 1864. And I promise you, I'm not going to try to refight all these other battles, campaigns that were part of the officer you're looking at, newly promoted to the rank of a lieutenant general, Ulysses S. Grant, brought east by President Lincoln in March of 1864 and given command of all the federal forces in the entire country. And Grant developed what we call in military parlance a concentration and time strategy. And if you look at the map, you'll see all these arrows, three up in Virginia, one in Georgia, and one down in the Gulf, pointing right toward Mobile. It almost makes you think that you're watching the weather and there's another tropical storm or a hurricane headed toward Mobile or New Orleans or one of the places on the Gulf Coast. Let's hope they don't have any more of those. But Grant put together this concentration and time strategy, and I want to talk about one of the prongs. The others you could pretty quickly dismiss with Banks and Butler and Franz Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley. And it boiled down to, if you were playing chess, you had two pieces on the board if one's board was red, white, and blue of the United States. And one piece, obviously, was Grant and Major General George Meade with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, going up against Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And the other piece on the chessboard was Major General William T. Sherman and his three armies going up against the Confederate Army of Tennessee under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. And Grant's biggest fear, and it truly was, if you go through the official records, if you go through the correspondence before the campaign began of Grant and Sherman writing back and forth, meeting face to face on a couple of occasions in Nashville and again in Cincinnati, planning out the final nuances of the campaign, Grant said to Sherman, I'll use a little modern terminology here. He's like, listen, Cump, because Sherman's nickname was Cump. Listen, Cump, whatever you do not let Joe Johnston send reinforcements up to Lee in Virginia. That was really Grant's biggest concern. So when he laid out the edict for all of his subordinates on their various parts of this campaign, he didn't tell Sherman, capture Atlanta. He basically said, get into the interior of Georgia, doing all the damage you can, keeping Joe Johnston occupied. And so I think Sherman certainly did that, plus a lot more. So we often don't think about, when we talk about the Overland Campaign in Virginia with Grant and Meade going up against R.E. Lee, or out here in the Western Theater, Sherman going up against Johnston. It was for Grant and Sherman, and they didn't have to be reminded of this every day, and President Lincoln did not do that. But both of them very much knew that the election was on the line, an election that Lincoln himself said he probably had zero chance of winning. So there was a little bit of motivation, if you will, for not only Grant, but for Sherman. And once Grant and Lee became bottlenecked up in a siege between Richmond and Petersburg, which lasted for almost 10 months, that one chess piece on the board is now cemented in place. You only have one movable piece if you're Lincoln, and that's Sherman. So the eyes of the North, the hopes of the North, the hopes of President Lincoln and his administration, the eyes turned toward Georgia. So Sherman either would get it done or he would not. So just quickly, I always like to share faces with all these names. We take for granted too many times that everyone in the world knows precisely what all these people look like. Most of you probably know what the officers I'm going to show you period photographs of, what they look like, but I always just like to offer that up. The largest individual on this slide, of course, is William T. Sherman. Sherman was in charge of what today we would call an army group. They didn't use that terminology in the 19th century. But as I've said earlier, Sherman had 3 armies, and I'll go quickly through them in order of size. I'm not going to bog us down talking about numbers. By far, the largest of Sherman's 3 armies, right in the middle, the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by Major General George Thomas. Interestingly, Thomas was a native Virginian who remained loyal to the Union. Second in size in Sherman's 3 armies, on the far right of the slide, Major General James McPherson, who commanded the Federal Army of the Tennessee, not to be confused with the Confederate Army of Tennessee. The is a small word, but it denotes a huge difference when you're talking about those 2 different armies. In the North, they name their armies after bodies of water, usually rivers. So thus, the Army of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee, named, as the Confederates did, their armies after either states or portions of states, a la the Army of Northern Virginia. So McPherson, commanding the Army of the Tennessee. And lastly, really an army on paper only. It was barely a division in size, which would have been somewhere around 12,000 or so troops, depending upon how one wanted to count them. And they all counted them slightly different ways, was Major General John Schofield. And again, with the Army of the Ohio. It was treated as an army. He was equals to Thomas and Schofield, but his force was far, far smaller than the other 2. Their counterparts on the other side in gray, the largest individual pictured, Joseph E. Johnston, Confederate ranking structure was different than the Federals. On the Federal side, the highest one could go was a lieutenant general. There was only one of those. You saw him 2 slides ago. That was Grant. They had a bunch of major generals. That was the next rung on the ladder, below the rung occupied by only one person, Grant. On the Confederate side, the highest one could go was general. Not, they didn't use the term full general, it's general. Eventually, the Confederacy had 8 of those. Confederacy had a lot of major generals. They also had quite a few lieutenant generals, the same rank that Grant had in the Federal armies. 3 of the 4 other officers on this slide, all these men direct reports to Johnston in the Army of Tennessee. 3 of the 4 were lieutenant generals. In the center, William Hardee, to Hardee's off of his left shoulder, John Bell Hood, directly beneath Hardee, Leonidas Polk, and in the bottom right-hand corner, the only major general in the group was Joe Wheeler. He was in charge of the cavalry for the Army of Tennessee. I would like to show you one officer that was in charge of Sherman's cavalry. That's why I didn't have any on Sherman's slide. He did not have one individual in charge of his cavalry. There were several. The structure was somewhat different. So we'd spend the rest of the night talking about the cavalry structure in Sherman's 3 armies if we got into that level of detail. So a little bit more simple and to the point on the Confederate side. Joe Wheeler was the man at the top for the boys in the saddle. The Atlanta campaign began, this was per Grant's plan. All of those other forces I talked about, Nathaniel Banks, which was to make a move on Mobile, that never happened because of the failed Red River campaign. Ben Butler got bottled up, Grant said, like a cork in a bottle on the peninsula in Virginia. Franz Sigel was defeated at the Battle of New Market in the Shenandoah Valley on May 15th of 1864. So all those pieces of the puzzle are back to the chess analogy. I don't even play chess. I don't know why I selected that. I'll show my ignorance of chess. You got 2 pieces that left, as I said, Grant and Sherman. So, but all of these others that I just mentioned, Banks and Sigel and Butler, along with Grant and Sherman, per Grant's strategy, they all were to move forward on or about the 5th of May, 1864. So at the exact same time, and I tell a lot of people here in Georgia, and there are a lot of people here that study the campaigns of Virginia, and they're very familiar with the Overland Campaign from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to the North Anna, the Cold Harbor, and eventually to the siege between Richmond and Petersburg. But they don't always stop and understand or think about at the exact time all those things were playing out in Virginia, the Atlanta campaign was taking place here in Georgia. So I always like to remind people it's easy to look at these things in a vacuum and think that, you know, when Sherman opened the Atlanta campaign around the 5th of May and sent his forces down to try to maintain possession of Tunnel Hill, in the bottom right, you can see a period photograph. That's the Western Atlantic Railroad. It still runs through that mountain range today. However, not shown in this photo, obviously, they had not built the new tunnel yet. As locomotives got bigger and faster, they would not fit through that tunnel anymore. So if you visit Tunnel Hill today, it is a state park. You can go there. You have 2 tunnels. They're not literally right side by side, but they're a fairly short distance apart. It's sort of interesting to contrast the old with the new. So I always tell people, you know, when Sherman opened the campaign up at Tunnel Hill, it was critically important for him to keep the tunnel open. I suppose the Confederates could have tried more than they did. There was some heavy skirmishing that took place in the vicinity of Tunnel Hill. But I mean, what are they going to do? Dynamite had not been invented yet, so they're not going to blow it up. I suppose they could have packed materiel on boxcars and set them on fire and rolled them into the tunnel. And that may have done some damage, but Sherman's engineers probably could have repaired it rather quickly. So Sherman, at the very beginning, knew that he had to keep the tunnel open because the Western Atlantic was going to be his supply line as he penetrated more deeply into Georgia, bringing supplies initially from his forward supply depot, which was in Chattanooga, which you can see on the map here, which is just barely in Tennessee. So if Sherman was going to get his 130 boxcars every day that he had calculated he would need to feed his troops, and we often forget about the fodder for the horses and the mules, the trains had to keep rolling. And if the trains were to roll, the tunnel needed to remain open. And it did. After, as I've said, some pretty heavy skirmishing there, actually the lion's share of it on the 6th, some on the 7th of May, Sherman was able to keep his tunnel open. Actually, the tunnel belonged to the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia built the railroad. The state of Georgia owned the railroad then. The state still owns the railroad today. It's under a long-term lease to CSX. So it was Georgia's railroad, Georgia's tunnel, not Sherman's, but Sherman thought it was his. And I guess since he got possession of it, he could claim it. So interesting story, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but you can see the big arrows like a football play here. Okay, we're going to do an end around. The running back's going to take the handoff from the quarterback and go around the right side off of the right tackle. That's sort of what's happening here. Sherman starting here, and he would replicate this time and again during the Atlanta campaign. Remember I said George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland, they were this behemoth army by far. You could have combined McPherson and Schofield's armies together, and Thomas's was still more than twice as big. So that's good. A lot of boots on the ground, but with an army of that size, it's around 71, 72,000 soldiers. You can't move them quickly. So Sherman tapped McPherson, shown in the bottom left-hand corner, and the Army of the Tennessee to become sort of his mobile strike force, if you will. And the first time that he deployed this, and this was one of those cases of hundreds and during the war, maybe perhaps thousands, of what might have been when the Federals conducted a demonstration on Dalton, which is what they called it, in February of 1864. Sherman had sent Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland from Chattanooga toward Dalton. He didn't give them orders, go in guns blazing and I want you to capture the place and burn everything down. It basically was a scouting, a probing mission, if you will. He asked Thomas and his troops to advance forward, find out the strong points of the Confederate positions, artillery positions, redans, redoubts, their earthworks, etc. In February, during that demonstration, they discovered that the gap through the mountain range there it's called Snake Creek Gap was totally unguarded. Now, they had no way of knowing. Maybe they crossed their fingers and said their prayers at night and hoped that when they launched the campaign in early May, that Snake Creek Gap would still be totally unguarded. And that was the case. So Sherman sent the other two arrows coming down from the north. The one pointing toward the letter A is Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland. The other one is Schofield coming down from the east of Chattanooga, almost due north approach to Dalton. Those were major movements, a whole lot of troops bearing down frontally on Dalton. That took the attention of the Confederates. So back to football and doing the end around, Sherman hands the football to McPherson, and he and the Army of the Tennessee go scampering around the right tackle, and they go all the way down, all the way through Snake Creek Gap. McPherson himself is standing on the tracks of the Western and Atlantic. If I'm Joe Johnston and I'm in Dalton, I'm in a bad position because I have Federals bearing down on me from the front. And I now have, he doesn't yet quite yet know, he will soon, there are Federals behind him in the form of McPherson and his army. And they're in a position to cut the railroad. The Western Atlantic Railroad also supplied Johnston's army during the campaign. Another ironies of the ironies of the campaign, the same rail line supplied both combatants. Sherman going south out of Chattanooga, and Johnston, the trains traveling north out of Atlanta up toward wherever Johnston might happen to be at whatever juncture during the campaign. So McPherson, there they are. They've made it through the gap. So far, so good. And then down to their right, down toward the railroad bridge crossing over the Oostenaula River, just a little north of Resaca, McPherson and his forces spot some Confederate cavalry. Wait a minute, there aren't supposed to be any Confederates down there. All the Confederates are up in Dalton. Who are those guys? Where did they come from? And might there be more of them? Well, McPherson's way down here in the gap by himself with his army, and there is no possible way Thomas and Schofield can come and reinforce him if he comes under attack. Since he saw Confederates where there were supposed to be none, McPherson decided that maybe it might work best to live to fight another day, as they would say. So he withdrew his forces from the gap, like putting a car in reverse and backing out. Come to find out later, those Confederates he spotted at Resaca was almost a handful of cavalry troops, and they were the very, very far advanced lead elements of Leonidas Polk's force, which Jefferson Davis had ordered to come over out of Alabama to reinforce the Confederate Army of Tennessee. McPherson probably could have defeated them in less time than it just took me to tell you that. But he didn't know what their troop strength was. Later that night, supposedly Sherman said to McPherson, whom he thought dearly of, so did Grant. Both of them treated McPherson like a son. I'm paraphrasing, but Sherman said, "I fear you have missed a great opportunity to end this war much sooner." So, but that's water under the bridge. And Johnston and Dalton, he gets word of what has happened, what had almost happened. He cannot afford to take that chance again. So he orders his troops to leave Dalton, fall back into partially pre-prepared defensive positions. Resaca, I'll pause for a moment to say that Johnston gets a lot of criticism, some of it deserved. I try to defend Johnston sometimes because I think he gets a bad rap when he shouldn't, but on certain things, but some he deserves. But one thing I think Johnston should be commended for is he was always thinking ahead. The detractors say, yes, I know Johnston was always preparing defensive fallback positions because he had no intention to fight. All he was going to do was retreat and fall back into the fortifications that he'd had pre-constructed. And that was just his modus operandi. And I understand where they're coming from, but I also tell them and others too, if you wait until you are forced to fall back to a position and then you try to start preparing defensive works, that's a little bit late. So I think Johnston did not always plan on falling back, although that sort of became like the broken record of the Atlanta campaign, starting with McPherson's almost end around through Snake Creek Gap. Johnston falls back to Resaca. The little smaller map, I know it's maybe a little bit difficult to see. On the right-hand side, 2 days, pretty heavy fighting at Resaca. If any of you have been to Georgia, if you've driven from Chattanooga to Atlanta on Interstate 75, you drove more or less right through the middle of the battlefield. This map actually shows I-75. If you're headed north, most of the federal positions were on the left of the interstate, today's interstate, and most of the Confederates were on the right. 2 days of heavy fighting, May 14th and 15th. One final thing about Resaca, most people don't realize of all the battles in the entire Atlanta campaign, Resaca was the second most costly in terms of casualties, second only to the Battle of Atlanta itself, which we will get to in just a few minutes. Another ironic thing about the Battle of Resaca, the casualties on both sides were almost identical. And you will not find that in too many cases anywhere in the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, or the Trans-Mississippi. Both sides endured about 2,800 casualties. So the Federals eventually make their way across the Oostenaula River, and it's almost like Dalton and Snake Creek Gap all over again. If you're Johnston and you're holding the defensive positions in Resaca, you now have, and every minute that goes by, there are more of them, Federal troops that are now behind you on the south side of the Oostenaula River. So it no longer made sense for Johnston to hold the position at Resaca. So he issued orders for his troops to fall back, leave Resaca. And I know this is a little bit hard to see, and I need to move this arrow. I apologize. You see the big arrow pointing down right the lower center of the screen. I'll talk about Cassville in a minute, which the arrow is covering. But up toward the top part of the arrow, you can barely make out Adairsville. When Johnston left the defenses at Resaca, according to the map he had in his possession, there was good ground in Adairsville. You all know what I'm talking about. You've heard the stories. Military dictum of the day stated that if you held the high ground, for your opponent to be able to overrun your position, they needed to outnumber you 3-1. Well, Sherman didn't outnumber Johnston 3-1. Sherman's three armies combined at the beginning of the campaign just a little over 100,000. And at Resaca, the battle we just fought in mid-May, Leonidas Polk's forces had arrived from Alabama to participate beginning at the Battle of Resaca, and that elevated Johnston's troop strength. The numbers in the records vary a little bit, but somewhere between 60 and 65,000. That was as high as it would ever be. Sherman would receive reinforcements during the campaign, not so much for Johnston. So, but Sherman did not outnumber him 2-1, 100,000 to 60 to 65,000. So the map that Johnston had indicated there was good ground in Adairsville, a ridge line, and he could anchor his flanks left and right, either against a river or a rocky mountainous area, or both. Well, Johnston arrives in Adairsville with his staff. He's sitting on horseback. He's looking out in front of him at the terrain. He's looking at the map. He's looking at the terrain, and the two don't even closely match. The map he had was just wrong. And that did not only happen to General Johnston here in Georgia, that happened many times. A lot of the generals north and south would say that an incorrect map was worse than not having a map at all. But Johnston's map, that good ground didn't exist. So they did not make a stand in Adairsville. They fell back to Cassville. And if Johnston had one of those, if I could turn the clock back and do this all over again, I think I would go back to May the 19th of 1864 to Cassville. Because at Cassville, the Confederates did have good ground in Cassville. Johnston wrote orders. They were read to all the soldiers in the Army of Tennessee. I've read many of their letters and diaries and so forth, and still today, almost 160 years later, you can still feel their enthusiasm go up. They were tired of falling back. They wanted to fight. And Johnston had finally unleashed them. Boys, in the morning we attack. And you can just feel it. I mean, still today, like I said, they were ready to go. Well, Johnston had a late night council of war. You know, many generals on both sides, they didn't believe in late night councils of war. Sherman didn't conduct late night councils of war, and General Lee typically didn't. Stonewall Jackson, neither. But Johnston, on occasion, would. If he had this to do all over again, he probably would not have. Had a late night council of war after midnight, early in the wee morning hours of May the 19th. And couriers went out looking for Hood and Hardee and Polk. And they couldn't find Hardee. And so Polk and Hood come to the meeting. Eventually they located Hardee and he arrived. But once Hardee arrived, the meeting basically was over. And Hood and Polk had talked Johnston out of attacking. I think they had some legitimate concerns, perhaps a little bit overblown, but I think they had some concerns in that the Federals, who had pulled right up across the way from the Confederates and established their positions and parked their artillery, they had a couple of guns positioned on some higher pieces of ground. And Hood and Polk were afraid that their forces perhaps could receive enfilading fire coming down your line, which you don't want to be in that situation. So they convinced Johnston to cancel the orders to attack in Cassville. And I've read those same letters and diaries from the soldiers, and you can just hear the spirits plummet and the wind going out of the sails. So, you know, I'll paraphrase one, but it'll cover for hundreds. Here we go again. We were ready to fight. We're falling back. Is that all we're ever going to do is fall back, fall back, fall back? And Johnston, after the war, said it was the biggest mistake I made. If I had it to do all over again, and I happen to agree, I should have fought in Cassville. I don't know that that would have changed the outcome of the campaign. It may have delayed the fall of Atlanta, which might have had an impact on the election. This particular little video clip, don't worry, there's no sound associated with this. I've got to thank my friends at the Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park for allowing me to use this. If you visit the battlefield and you watch the movie in the visitor center, this is a clip from that movie that is narrated. I can't use the voiceover for copyright, for royalty reasons, but I'm allowed to use the video clip after Cassville. And sorry, boys, I'm Johnston, paraphrasing. We better not fight here in Cassville. We're going to fall back to Allatoona Pass. And they had started preparing some defensive works at Allatoona Pass too. And Sherman comes up to Allatoona. He had seen Allatoona before. In the 1840s, not long out of West Point, one of Sherman's first assignments was on the coast, back and forth between Charleston and Savannah. And he came to Marietta, just north of Atlanta, and was here in the mid-1840s for about 8 weeks, going from Atlanta all the way up to Chattanooga, investigating civilian claims from the Second Seminole War. If I gave Mike a wagon, if he was on his way to Florida, or if I gave him a horse, or if I gave him anything, after the Second Seminole War, I could file a claim with the U.S. War Department and say, I want to be paid for my wagon. Well, that the Army had to send people out across the country to go try to verify those claims. And Tecumseh Sherman is the individual that they happened to send to this part of Georgia. So ironically, Sherman knew more about the terrain between Atlanta and Chattanooga than a lot of the Confederate officers he was going up against, because he had been here 20 years before. Sherman didn't want to have anything to do with Allatoona Pass, what the little video clip just quickly illustrated. For the first and the only time during the Atlanta campaign, he broke from his supply line, the Western Atlantic Railroad, swung very wide to his right. I will sound like a broken record, starting with McPherson's move at Snake Creek Gap. Once again, we see it here. Time and time again, Sherman always moved to his right, trying to get around the left flank of the Confederate forces over and over and over again, with one exception. And we'll get to that near the end. So Sherman leaves the Western Atlantic Railroad. Okay, I'm going to let Johnston and his troops have all of Allatoona Pass they want. I'm just going to go around them. I'll get behind them. I'll cut the Western Atlantic Railroad. I'll capture Marietta, which was a major Confederate hospital center. And old Joe can do whatever Joe wants to do. If I'm Sherman speaking, I'm now in his rear, and I probably can dance into Atlanta if I choose to do so, totally uncontested. So that was Sherman's plan of breaking from his railroad, his supply line. He knew it was a little bit risky, but he didn't plan to go over into Paulding County and live the rest of his life. This was going to be a fairly quick maneuver and hopefully get around the left flank and get in behind the Army of Tennessee. I give kudos to the Confederate cavalry on this particular campaign. They were on top of their game. They quickly picked up on what Sherman was doing, and they informed General Johnston, and the Confederates basically just slid to their left over into Paulding County and blocked off Sherman's three armies. And there were actually three battles. Why the Battle of Dallas, which was number 3, is not shown on this video, I have no idea. But the first of 3 battles took place on May the 25th at New Hope Church, was a Confederate victory. 2 days later, May 27th, the Battle of Pickett's Mill was also a victory for the battle fought that day. Sherman's like, you know what? I've had enough of this. His troops had lost 2 battles, New Hope, Pickett's Mill. They were running low on supplies, and his troops, because they suffered some pretty severe casualties, and this was very rugged terrain. So after New Hope and Pickett's Mill, they had given a name to this whole area. The soldiers, the Federal soldiers, called it the Hell Hole. And I guess Sherman decided he was going to get the hell out of the Hell Hole. So he issued orders for his troops to pull out of their positions, move back to the east, and reconnect with their line of supply, the railroad. Well, the Confederates, on the 28th of May, they knew the Federals had left New Hope, that they left Pickett's Mill, and they believed that McPherson's troops in Dallas, the one that's not shown on this video clip, were also preparing to leave. They were not. The Confederates, under plans from Hardee to attack, began to step off toward their opponent. They pretty quickly, through reconnaissance, learned that the Federals were still in position in their earthworks at Dallas. The order went out to cancel the attack. Only about half of the advancing Confederate forces got the order in time. The other half did not get the order. They went on in, and you can imagine what happened. It was not good. That was a Confederate defeat. I'm going to go through these next 3 quickly. They're basically maps. All of these are from, I'll probably always call it the Civil War Trust. I know it's the American Battlefields Trust, all the wonderful work they do. This is just one of their maps on New Hope, which Joe Hooker and the 20th Corps were the primary federal unit engaged at New Hope Church. We talked about Pickett's Mill, Major General Thomas Wood, pictured in the top left corner. Its forces were the attackers at Pickett's Mill, probably one of the best Confederate officers in the Western Theater. Major General Patrick Claiborne, shown on the right, was in charge of the Confederate forces at Pickett's Mill. And as I said, that was a Confederate victory. And then the Confederate defeat at Dallas, you had Hardee and his troops going up against McPherson and the Army of the Tennessee. And I talked about that the order went out to cancel the attack, and only about half of the forces got that order and fell back. The others continued on forward, and that was not a good day to be in Hardee's command, and that sector of the field did not get the orders to fall back. So after the fighting in Paulding County, which is where Dallas, New Hope, and Pickett's Mill are located, ironically, where does Sherman go? To Allatoona Pass, where Johnston was before this maneuver took place over into Paulding. And so Sherman and his three armies go to Allatoona Pass, and Johnston and the Army of Tennessee fall back to Cobb County, Georgia, where a lot of the fighting, we're now in early June of 1864. And I'm not going to talk about all the various positions they held. I'm going to talk about the two primary battles that took place here in Cobb County, which is the last line of defense, so to speak, on this side of the Chattahoochee River. The Chattahoochee River separating Cobb County from the Atlanta side. First, 5 days before they fought the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain on June 22nd at the Battle of Cobb's Farm, Johnston had become concerned that Sherman was trying once again to move around his left flank, and Sherman was, with Schofield's troops and the Army of the Ohio. So Johnston ordered John Bell Hood and his command. They were the far right flank of the Confederate line, which they were positioned atop Big Kennesaw Mountain, down the side of the mountain, across the railroad tracks, and then out into the distance a bit with Joe Wheeler and the cavalry anchoring the right flank. Red Jackson and his cavalry forces were anchoring the left flank. Johnston wanted to extend his line to the left, so he ordered Hood to move. Instead of Hood being the right flank of the Army of Tennessee, he was going to fall back behind the entire army, march all the way down southward, and become the left flank of the army. Hood arrives in an area called the Cobb Farmhouse portion of the battlefield on the 22nd of June, and Hood really made two mistakes. You probably could forgive him for one. I think had it been successful, there would have not been anything said. He did not ask General Johnston for permission to attack. So that probably could have been forgiven. The other mistake he made, and Hood knew better. I mean, this was not Hood's first time of seeing the elephant, so to speak. He was a seasoned veteran. You do not go in blind. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to attack an opponent, you need to have a pretty darn good idea of what you have in front of you. And you can only get that through some reconnaissance efforts, sending your cavalry out, sending your pickets forward, seeing if they draw fire. Hood did none of the above. And I understand what Hood was trying to accomplish. He got his men into position. He spotted a few Federals far out in the distance. It gets to be a pretty heavily wooded area. And he thinks he sees Federal forces falling back. And maybe he can seize the moment and launch an attack and defeat part of Sherman's forces when they've got their guard down. So he orders the attack, and they just got boots on the ground. He had no idea what was in front of him. So unfortunately, as you can see on this map from the truss, as his men started advancing across the field, they got a little over halfway. The Federals withheld their fire purposely. And then you can see right above Fighting Joe's image and the word Hooker, you can see the artillery batteries starting with the 13th New York down to the 1st Michigan. The Federals had about 40 artillery pieces concealed in the wood line. And unfortunately, Hood's troops did not find out until they heard the firing, the belching of the flames. And is it surprise anyone that Hood incurred 1,000 casualties in about the time it took me to say that? So not a very good day. Lesson learned there, which Hood already knew, but don't go in blind. So, and that a lot, it gets overlooked a lot because of the battle 5 days later. But this was a pretty serious affair at the Battle of Cobb's Farm. Another little video clip from the folks at the battlefield. See Atlanta off in the distance. You see the town of Marietta that I mentioned. That was a major Confederate hospital center. The red lines indicate the Confederate defensive positions from the top. Their right flank, Big Kennesaw Mountain. Next, if you're going from right down to the left, Big Kennesaw Mountain, Little Kennesaw Mountain, Pigeon Hill. We'll get down to where the hottest part of the fighting took place in just a bit. And then far down off in the distance, the red line is in the vicinity of the Cobb Farm area where we just talked about Hood fighting on the 22nd. This is another little clip. This is the furnace of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This is where we would not have wanted to have been in this sector of the field. It did not matter what color your uniform. Certainly you did not want to be if your uniform were blue. A lot of the boys who attacked here were under the commands of Brigadier General Charles Harker and Colonel Dan McCord, and George Thomas was tasked by Sherman, and Sherman didn't micromanage Thomas. He basically told him, I want you to find a position of your choosing somewhere in the center of Johnston's line, and I want you to order your troops to attack there. It's Dan McCook. I think I said McCall a minute ago. So, Thomas isn't stupid. And I mean, I always like to think that most of these officers and soldiers on both sides typically use common sense. So if you're going to attack your opponent that's holding the high ground, as the Confederates were here, would you rather advance across an open area that you had to traverse 1,000 yards, or would you rather advance across an open area where you maybe only had to cover a couple of 100 yards? I think I'll take the 200-yard path because you're going to be under fire, obviously, for a shorter amount of time. So Thomas selected the point. It's almost in the center of the Confederate line from left flank up to the right to launch his attack on the morning of June 27th. It was an incredibly hot morning. I've seen in several letters, diaries of soldiers north and south, and I'm guessing they had thermometers somewhere. Somebody did on the battlefield. I don't think they would just make this up, but northern and southern accounts, and more than one on both, that by 9 o'clock that morning, it was already 100 degrees. And 9 o'clock was about the time that Thomas's troops stepped off. About an hour earlier, McPherson's forces launched a feint attack on Big Kennesaw Mountain, while Schofield was demonstrating down on the right flank of the Federal line against the Confederate left flank or Hood's troops. But this was the meat and the sandwich of the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. George Thomas's troops in the Army of the Cumberland, Brigadier General Harker and Colonel Dan McCook's forces, a lot of boys from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, The only large monument on the battlefield at Kennesaw Mountain is the Illinois Monument at about the point of that dead angle or the salient position. None of the Federals ever penetrated the Confederate earthworks there after the battle because of the Confederate officer in charge of this part of the field, Ben Frank Cheatham. It got the name Cheatham's Hill, and that's what it's still called today. When everything was said and done, there were roughly 800 or so bodies in blue scattering the field like a carpet of blue beneath this salient position. Sherman incurred about 3,000 casualties during the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Johnston lost about 1,000, killed, wounded, and missing. The lion's share of Sherman's casualties were because of the fighting here at Cheatham Hill. This is just an overview map of the entire Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield Park. And let me see if I can get my little annotator here. I think this will work. You should be able to see the mouse. Big Kennesaw Mountain, Little Kennesaw Mountain, Pigeon Hill, and where we just were, Cheatham Hill, with Ben Frank Cheatham and his troops. Claiborne was to Cheatham's right. And on down off this map is the Cobb Farm area where Hood's forces were positioned. So if you get a chance to visit the Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park, visit all these sites. If you're pressed for time, go to Cheatham Hill, and certainly take time to retrace the Federal approach, for example, to what became the bloody fields below that high ground that Confederates held. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, Sherman always trying to move around Johnston's left flank. Once again, that's happening. And initially with Schofield's troops, they make their way around the far left flank, Hood's forces down below the Cobb Farm area. The Federals have cavalry in the vicinity of the Chattahoochee River, which you see on the screen now. So if you're General Johnston holding the defenses of Kennesaw Mountain, and you now have Federals closer to the river and threatening a crossing of the river, it no longer makes sense to hold the Kennesaw Mountain line. So on the evening of July the 2nd, Johnston issues orders for the Confederate Army to fall back, leave their defenses, make their way southward toward the Chattahoochee River. On Independence Day of 1864, this red line, this is a period map. I think this was actually done by one of Sherman's cartographers that he had in the field. The red indicates the Confederate position, which was pre-prepared under Johnston's orders before they even fought the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This was set up to be a holding action to allow the rest of the Army of Tennessee to fall back and occupy the Chattahoochee River line. They fought here on Independence Day. Primarily it was Hood's troops, a heavy day of very heavy artillery fighting, and a hectic day, I should have said, instead of a heavy day, a hectic day of heavy artillery fighting. And once again, anybody want to guess what Sherman did? He made his way around the left flank of the Confederate line, but Hood and his troops had held long enough that all the Confederates were able to fall back and occupy the Chattahoochee River line. The gentleman you see on the screen in the bottom left-hand corner, Brigadier General Francis Asbury Shoup. Shoup's in charge of the artillery for the Army of Tennessee. What is the guy in charge of the artillery doing, designing earthworks and defensive positions? It's an interesting story. I could talk for a long time. I'm not going to, about Shoup and his background and how and why this came to be. But suffice it to say, Shoup approached General Johnston on the 18th of June before they fought at Kennesaw Mountain on the 27th of June with the idea of a never before built series of defensive positions They basically were like three-sided log cabins without a roof, positioned between 60 and 175 yards apart. And they were designed so each, they got the name Shoepade at the time. Trust me, nobody called them that during the war. We call them that today. Major General G.W. Smith was acquainted with Shoup. He inspected one of the positions. According to Shoup's writings, Smith told him, Shoup, these Shoepades are going to make you famous. And I think Smith probably took Shoup's last name, married it with stockade, which was a fairly common term used for defensive positions. And voila, he comes up with Shoepade. So each of these Shoepades were designed to hold 80 soldiers. Sherman comes up on the morning of July the 5th, would have been the first time he would have seen the defensive works in daylight. The Confederates occupied the line on the evening of July the 4th. Federals come up on the morning of July 5th. Sherman and his chief engineer officer, Captain Orlando Poe, they take a quick look at this with their field glasses. George Thomas is with them. And Sherman basically is thinking, thanks, but no thanks. He probably sent the shortest telegraph to Washington that he'd ever sent in his life. I must study this case a little. And study it he did. This is a diagram, or actually an illustration that I just popped up that I forgot about. The late Bill Scaife, who was a historian who lived up actually on the battlefield at Allatoona Pass here in Georgia, did a lot of work researching the Chattahoochee River line, and he built a model, not to scale, but he built a model of a Shoepade, and that's what that illustration is, with the soldiers standing up on the ledge or the banquette, preparing to open fire and to support. If you're in the one that's in the center on the screen, and you come under attack, the Shoepade to the left and the Shoepade to the right could support you with artillery fire, and if they were closer, perhaps with rifle fire. So the first and only time, if you're ready, here it is. Here's the first in the Atlanta campaign. Sherman broke the mold, although I think he snookered Johnston at the river line, because how many times, and I didn't tell you all of them, I told you the major ones. Sherman, every time he moved, he always moved around the left flank of the Confederates, always around the left. Here they are set up along the banks of the Chattahoochee River on the Cobb County side of the river, and Sherman is massing troops down toward the Confederate left flank. Cavalry troops, infantry, artillery. If I'm Johnston, you know, this guy's already done this multiple times. Here he goes again. Sherman had no intentions of going around the left. This time, his plan was to move Schofield, pictured the smaller of the two images, along with Brigadier General Kenner Garrard. His forces were already up in Roswell, which you can see up at the top of the map. Sherman's plan here was to move Schofield up in the vicinity of Roswell. How many Confederates were up there to resist the Federal crossing of the Chattahoochee River in that vicinity? Almost zero, because they were planning, they had this strong defensive work stretched for over 6 miles in the Chattahoochee River line. And I think Johnston threw a curveball, Sherman threw a curveball to Johnston. In this particular case, he goes around the left, and he had never done that before, but he did it here. And now, once again, if you're Johnston, it no longer makes sense to hold the river line, because you have Federals in rapid numbers going across and getting onto the Atlanta side of the river. So the Confederates evacuate the river line on the evening of July the 9th. They fall back into start occupying the outer defenses of Atlanta, say goodbye to Old Joe, because Old Joe is going to leave us for a bit. Entering the picture on July 17th, Jefferson Davis fired General Johnston, and elevated to command of the Army of Tennessee, John Bell Hood. I'm a big football fan. I always like to use the football analogy. I know Hood gets a bad rap. He didn't have good days at Franklin or Nashville in Tennessee in November and December of 1864 by any stretch. But back up the clock a little bit, July of 1864, the Confederates must hold Atlanta. So I use the analogy, if you go into the fourth quarter of a football game and you're behind by 3 touchdowns, you are not going to be running the ball. You're going to be throwing, you're going to be trying to strike hard and strike quick and just knock your opponent out. That's sort of the position that Hood finds himself in. And Jefferson Davis knew there was one thing you could count on with Hood. He was a fighter. And Schofield was the one that picked up on this information. Schofield was classmates with Hood at West Point. And I think Schofield was very leery of Hood. So Schofield goes into Sherman's tent to inform him, General Sherman, I got some bad news. Hood's now in command of the Confederate Army. And supposedly Sherman kicked back with a grin from ear to ear and said, perfect. That's exactly what I want. Great news. Schofield probably looked at him like, have you lost your mind? Sherman said, that is the ideal man I want in that job because I know precisely what he will do. He will play right into my strengths. And so as it turned out, that's what happened. I always say, and I'm almost done, I always say, I know Hood gets a lot of criticism. He wasn't perfect. None of us are. But the battle plans that Hood developed for 3 consecutive battles on the 20th of July at Peachtree Creek, there was nothing wrong with the battle plan. The same for the Battle of Atlanta and the Battle of Ezra Church, which I'll quickly go through in a minute. All of a sudden, I don't know, sometimes I think it was, you know, anytime you have a change at the top, if you're in business or whatever, and you have a new CEO that comes in, sometimes I think that addles people. But all of a sudden, for the Confederates, it was like someone flipped a switch. And they had a very difficult time launching their attacks in unison, beginning with Peachtree Creek. They were supposed, primarily Hardee's troops engaged here. They were supposed to all move forward at precisely the same moment. You can see on the map, hopefully you can see, going up against Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, as they're crossing the creek and before they get on the other side and have a chance to set up any defensive positions. And the Confederates did anything but attack in unison. It was piecemeal, it was broken, it just did not work. And they were defeated at Peachtree Creek. Again, you can't blame that necessarily on Hood. On paper, the battle plan was sound. 2 days later, some believe Hood as punishment to Hardee, and I will also say, beginning with Peachtree Creek, continuing to the Battle of Atlanta, to continuing, he couldn't blame him, Ezra Church on him because Hardee wasn't there, but the final one at Jonesboro, all of a sudden, if I'm Hood, everything that goes wrong in the Army of Tennessee here in Georgia, it's Hardee's fault. So every dispatch he would write to Richmond, anything that went awry, it was Hardee's fault. So some people believe that perhaps as punishment, and it really wasn't Hardee's fault at Peachtree Creek, Hood ordered his troops to make an all-night march. Some of you have been here in Georgia. It's hot right now. It was 92 degrees today. I think it's supposed to get down to 80 tonight, and the humidity is about 88%. So he ordered Hardee's troops to march all night long. They already fought all day at Peachtree Creek. They're tired, they're hungry. A lot of them are low on ammunition, some wounded. And their orders were to march all the way to Atlanta, south of Atlanta, swing up to the northeast and get in behind McPherson's Army of D Tennessee, which was out east of Atlanta in the Decatur area, And Hardee saw pretty quickly in this march, troops falling by the wayside. They were not going to be able to get in position in time to hit from the rear. So he asked Hood for permission to get basically in front of McPherson and attack, and Hood agreed. And once again, sort of not going in unison, but attacking in piecemeal fashion. And by far, the largest battle of the entire Atlanta campaign, the Battle of Atlanta, the battle that is depicted in the cyclorama painting, which is newly restored and in her new home at the Atlanta History Center. That is the battle that painting is depicting. Again, a Federal victory. One more battle quickly, and then to the final. Ezra Church, July 28th. And again, if you study Hood's battle plan here, there's nothing wrong strategically with the battle plan. The officer in the top left-hand corner is the Federal Major General Oliver Otis Howard. Bottom right corner is Lieutenant General Stephen D. Lee. Lee did not have much Georgia clay on his boots because he'd only been here about a week. He had been out in Mississippi most recently fighting with Nathan Bedford Forrest at the Battle of Tupelo, which was a Confederate defeat. And they had ordered Lee, S.D. Lee, to come to Georgia and become part of Hood's army. So Hood drew up a pretty sound plan. Lee was to advance out the Lickskillet Road, which you can see on the white map, and find the Federals. They knew that Sherman was moving around the west side of the city. They were not sure exactly how many troops he had and where they were, but Hood told Lee, advance out the Lickskillet Road until you see the Federals, and you stop and dig in. Coming up behind you on the Lickskillet Road is going to be A.P. Stewart's corps. Stewart, when he sees you, will go behind your ranks, and he will go around, and when he gets into position, he will attack the Federals from their flank while you attack them from the front. On paper, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not picking on S.D. Lee. Lee goes out the Lickskillet Road. The first thing he sees with a blue uniform on, he starts sending his troops in onesies and twosies, piecemeal fashion. They got chewed up and spit out. By the time Stewart arrived, it was over. Well, you can't blame that on Hood either. Hood wasn't there. He drew up the plan and issued the orders. They just were not executed in the manner that he had expected. The final battle, and we'll be done in about 2 minutes, the Battle of Jonesboro, fought the last day of August, first day of September. The first day, August 31st, Hardee was in the vicinity of Jonesboro along with S.D. Lee. So you had two Confederate corps. And the Confederates actually attacked first on August 31st. Sherman's three armies were arriving, but they were not all in position. So very early, the Confederates actually outnumbered the Federals. So Hardee attacked. They had some early success, but by this point, remember, in those three battles, Peachtree Creek, Battle of Atlanta, and Ezra Church, Hood had lost a third of the soldiers in the Army of Tennessee. How many reinforcements are on the way? 0. That's just General Hood. I'm sorry, but you're now operating with 1/3 less effective strength prior to those battles. So Hardee and Lee attacked. They had some early success. You got more and more. Sherman had received some reinforcements. Actually, by this point in the campaign, he had more troops than he had when the campaign started in early May. So as more and more Federals come up, and then the cover of darkness settles over the field, the fighting ends on August 31st. During the night, Hood receives intelligence that there are large bodies of Federal infantry and cavalry approaching Atlanta from a due north position. Well, Hood didn't have a crystal ball. He couldn't predict the future. You have to take, until you can prove it right or wrong, you have to take intelligence information in the time of war at face value and make a decision and act. And that's what Hood did. He withdrew S.D. Lee's command from Jonesboro back to Atlanta. If there are Federals approaching quickly on Atlanta, I've got to have Lee's troops back or we will be overrun. The Georgia militia units and the Home Guard units cannot hold the fortifications. It turns out that report was false. You can't blame Hood for that either. He did not know at the time. He took the best information available and made the decision. So day 2, September 1st, the second day of the fighting at Jonesboro, you've got Hardee's Corps by himself facing all 3 of Sherman's armies. Anybody want to guess the outcome? It was not good if you were carrying the Confederate colors. And one thing, again, all this was Hardee's fault, by the way, if I'm Hood. And one thing that I believe Hardee has never gotten credit for, which I think he deserves, after he left Jonesboro and the Confederate Army under Hood's command had to evacuate Atlanta, Hardee is the one who found and established a fallback position near Lovejoy that probably kept the Army of Tennessee from being wiped off the map here in Georgia in early September of 1864, instead of it being wiped off the map in the last day of November and December the 15th of 1864 at Franklin and Nashville. Because Hardee selected a very good position, had very stout earthworks built and thrown up, and Hood and all the rest of the troops occupied those. Did Hood give Hardee any credit for that? Zero. And again, this is just a map showing some of the fighting day 1 versus day 2 at the Battle of Jonesboro. I've already talked through most of the particulars with that. One of 2 famous quotes from Sherman, this one issued on September the 2nd to President Lincoln: "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." The destruction you see in the background, the railroads east of Atlanta, the Federals didn't blow those up or burn them. The Confederates did. And again, you can't blame this on Hood either. Hood ordered the torches lit, but days before the last railroad line going out of Atlanta was cut, you had 80 some boxcars sitting on the rails out there loaded with gunpowder, shot shell, artillery pieces, et cetera, and Hood issued very clear orders: get those trains out of here. And somebody dropped the ball. And now all the rails are cut and you can't get them out. So there they sit. And if you're Hood, you certainly do not want those to fall into the possession of Sherman and his forces. So Hood ordered the cars burnt, and it woke people up within about 150 mile radius. This happened 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on September the 2nd. Some people wrote in their letters and so forth at the time that they thought the earth was, or the world was coming to an end. So this is the destruction, what's left. The only thing that didn't burn were the axles and the metal wheels. Everything else went up in smoke, and Sherman could send his dispatch to Washington and to President Lincoln. Thank you all very much. And now I will take a look at the chat window and we'll see what type of questions we'll have. And I promise you we will answer them all. Thank you again very much for your time and attention.